My name is Hugh Long. I am currently the president of the Board of Trustees of the LPO. I was also in that position at the time of Katrina. I've lived in New Orleans since 1969. Um, Moved here to join the faculty of Tulane University. I still serve on that faculty as a professor. Um, the Katrina was the first time I or members of my family had ever evacuated New Orleans for a storm. Katrina happened approximately 3 weeks before the LPO season, the 2005-06 season, was to have begun. We were very lucky in two respects, one of which was the fact that most of the musicians were not here, and many of those who were not here had their instruments with them. The second way in which we were amazingly fortunate was that by the time Katrina had happened, the world of instant communication had dawned and people had cell phones. By the time we figured out where everybody was, it turned out to be 23 states, Canada, two overseas foreign countries for the musicians. We had, I think, staff in 6 or 7 cities and community trustees in a dozen cities or so. And again, no one was in New Orleans. There was one exception to that. One of the section violinists did not evacuate and actually was stuck in New Orleans for about a week until there was an evacuation possible. Other than that, everybody was someplace else. Very early on, of course, there were serious questions about what was going to happen to the city, let alone its orchestra. Then amazing things started to happen. Mostly kindness of people who knew about us and kindness of strangers. Musicians committees around the country and orchestras made donations. Orchestras, the legal entity of the orchestra, made donations. Individual musicians made donations. The general public made donations. There were eventually donations from the American Federation of Musicians, donations from the League of American Orchestras, as well as some very generous grants from foundations who had previous relationships with us. For example, the Mellon Foundation made a special emergency grant of sufficient money to pay for health insurance for all the musicians and staff for that season. Because we were declared a federal disaster area, even though we were a 501c3, I was allowed under that provision to make grants from the LPO as a corporation to its individual musicians. And we made two emergency disbursements to every musician, not tied to any performance, not tied to whether you came back or not. But we made two $1,000 grants to each musician who was contracted for the 5-6 season. Then the really extraordinary things that happened were first, we were contacted by Alan Valentine, who was the CEO at the Nashville Symphony. They invited us to have so-called opening night a few weeks late in Nashville on their nickel as a gesture of one music city to another. They flew them in, they put them up at hotels, they made available appropriate concert attire if they didn't have it. Their volunteers brought in meals, et cetera, and we had opening night. And our outgoing music director and our incoming music director both showed up and each shared the podium for a portion of the concert. Probably the most emotional recollection that I have of that evening was that the TPAC, large venue with big lobbies on both the balcony and main levels, and all the concessions were in full swing, and there were spotted around the lobby donation cans or buckets or whatever it was, where people could donate additional money to the LPO. And at the end of the evening, the bartenders took their tip jars and emptied them into the donations baskets. The other thing that had happened between the time that Nashville was set and it's actually happening was that we had gotten another call from a guy named Zaran Mehta, who was the brother of Zubin Mehta, the famous conductor, and Zaran happened to be the chief executive officer of the New York Philharmonic. And he extended an invitation to us to do a side-by-side with the New York Phil. A couple of weeks, I don't know, 10 days, 2 weeks prior to that, there had been a cold call to the office in Baton Rouge. And this guy on the other end of the phone said to our ED, "You don't know me, but my name is Michael Kaiser, and I'm the president of the Kennedy Center, and I would like to help the LPO." It was his conclusion that the continuation of the classical arts, performing arts in New Orleans was more dependent on the LPO than it was on the other institutions, which in fact depended on us. So he wanted to ensure that we made it. And he felt that he could go to his board and to other contacts he had and raise a significant amount of money for us if we were willing to sign on to committing to having the orchestra back as soon as possible. And in fact, we met with him in the boardroom of the New York Phil the day before the side-by-side. And he walked into that meeting and said, "Well, this turned out to be much harder than I thought it was going to be because lots of people are giving lots of money to lots of different things in New Orleans. So I have not raised as much money as I originally thought. I've only been able to do the following," and he started listing 50,000 here, 75,000 there, et cetera, et cetera. It added up to almost $500,000. We then had a major gift from the Taylor Foundation, Phyllis Taylor, who underwrote bringing musicians back to New Orleans for the first full concert in New Orleans, which was at the very beginning of December in the St. Louis Cathedral. The other amazing thing was, as I had mentioned, we had sold subscriptions to a full 2005-06 classical season. I think there were 2 or 3 subscribers who asked for their money back. And so the combination of all of those kinds of things are why the LPO was able to come back and in fact thrive. With the Orpheum, we had lost chairs and stand lights and a lot of percussion instruments, which others can tell you about. But we sort of cobbled things together and went from place to place, which in retrospect was actually a very good thing in that it brought us a lot closer to our audience and potential audience than if we had sort of stayed at one central location. What we lost with the Orpheum was an acoustical gem, and there's every indication that the careful work that's been done by the new owners in restoring and renovating the space has been done in such a way as to preserve the acoustical characteristics of the auditorium, and so we are very much looking forward to being back in a venue which, while not originally built for a symphony orchestra, turned out probably by accident, since it was originally a vaudeville hall, but turned out to be just a wonderful venue for live symphonic music in its full natural state, no mics required. So we're really looking forward to returning on September 17th of 2015, which is very close to, and I haven't gone back to look at what the originally scheduled opening night was 2005, but it's very close in date to what was originally expected to happen 10 years earlier.